Okay, alhamdulillah. All right. My name is Zuhair Shaath, and I help put these slides together. So, yes. Huh? I'm sorry? Oh, we speak up. I'll go ahead. Abdullah has to come sit up here anyways. All right, and you came in a little late. Go ahead, introduce yourself. Whatever you want to introduce us. Okay, alhamdulillah. And that's what we're here for. Last week we covered the first half of the testimony of faith, which is belief in Allah, right? And we talked about what that entails and what crosses the line in terms of belief and what is okay, all right? We also discussed the necessity of having a prophet, right? And if there is a God, that means there needs to be some sort of divine guidance from him. And that essentially is what the prophets all called to. And we discussed a little bit about the birth of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as well as some of the things that happened and occurred before prophecy. Today, let's talk about the beginning of Revelation and how essentially the moments that led to the changing of the history of the world. All right. So before, if you'll recall, at the time, there was a lot of issues in terms of social dealings, okay? There was no respect for women. They were treated as property. Even their daughters at an early age were buried alive. There was oppression, widows, orphans. None of them were looked after for or taken care of. And we talked about the issues that a tribal society has, in the sense that one tribe is bigger than the other, then there is no necessary justice, all right? So all of these things would occur, and the Prophet and Muhammad at this point in time would reflect on them often. And in fact, he would actually go and seclude himself to meditate and to reflect in a cave called Hira in Arabic, okay? And up until actually right before prophecy and revelation came down, right beforehand, he would actually see true dreams for about a period of about 6 months. So he would have a dream, he would wake up, and then the events would occur right in front of him and unfold. And this happened for almost 6 months before revelation actually came down. So one day, and he would actually, when he would do this, he would feel the need to go more often. And so one day he's there, and this cave is very small, maybe fits a couple people. If anyone's ever done pilgrimage or minor pilgrimage, Hajj or Umrah, sometimes you can actually go and visit these sites. It's a small cave, maybe 2-3 people can fit in it. So he would go, he would take some food, maybe it would last him for the weekend or whatever, and then come back to his wife Khadija, all right? So one day while he's there, all of a sudden he hears something, okay? And not just he hears it, but he also feels it. He feels a presence come up behind him and give him a good big bear hug, all right? So anyone who hugs someone knows like a good squeeze is like a bear hug, all right? And he feels this, and he's alone in the cave. It's not very big. So imagine like what's going on in his head, right? Because at the end of the day, he's human. He's like, what just came out, right? And he hears this noise, iqra, read. And he says, I don't read, right? At that time, remember, Arabia was an oral tradition or oral society where everything was spoken and memorized. Not a lot was written down necessarily. It says, read, iqra, iqra, iqra. And you'd keep replying back, I don't read, I don't know how to, right? Like, it's not something I'm capable of. Before we move on, some of the scholars actually touch on the importance of actually the hug that Angel Gabriel gave him, right? And imagine what would be the benefit of that? Let me ask you guys this. What would be the benefit of that hug, for instance? Huh? Confidence? So it wasn't like comfort? It wasn't like a comforting hug though necessarily. Like he was squeezing him like hard. Yes. Very good. Imagine you're in a cave and all of a sudden you hear voices, right? You might think you're going crazy or something, all right? The fact that the touch was there, so like when you go through something unbelievable, you're like, dude, if this is real, pinch me, right? Like, because if it happens, then it's real, it's not a dream. So this is essentially like pinching taken to like an extreme, right? Like a big bear hug, all right? So this is something trying also a way of showing him that this is actually really happening, all right? And that this is serious business. So the first 5 verses of the Quran are revealed at this point in time. اقرأ بسم ربك الذي خلق. Recite in the name of your Lord who created. خلق الإنسان من علق. Created man from a clinging substance. اقرأ وربك الأكرم. Recite, and your Lord is the most generous. الذي علم بالقلم. Who taught by the pen. علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. He taught man that which he knew not. And we talked about the purpose of knowledge and reading and recitation, and how we're always encouraged to always learn and to keep studying. Okay? So these are the first verses ever revealed in the Quran. And for him, it was a life-changing moment. All right? So what happens after this occurs? He goes back to his wife Khadija. All right? For those that don't know, Khadija was his wife. She was a little bit older than him, about maybe 10, 15 years, some scholars say. But she was also very wealthy. And she was financially supporting the Prophet at a certain time. He also used to work for her. Like he would go and do trading and stuff like that in her name. So she was rich, she was financially stable. So this also shows you that while at that time there were issues, there were also opportunities for women at the time as well. So he comes back to his wife, and he's kind of not necessarily like having a panic attack, but obviously psychologically you can imagine, right? He's a prophet, he is a man. Okay? So he says, cover me, right? He just wants to be covered and feel that safety and security. And so what she says to him, right? So he tells her what happens. And so she's sitting there and she's thinking about it. And this really shows some of the wisdom that Khadija had at that time, right? Because her words were very wise words. Okay? She knew who the Prophet was and she knew what his character was like. She says to him, God will never disgrace you. You are kind to your family. You aid the weak. You help people in need. You're generous with your guests, and you struggle for the truth. All right? These are 5 things, and these 5 things also show furthermore the character and the Prophet even before revelation came. All right? These are things that anyone, even before Islam came, they knew for sure these things about the Prophet. So it shows you just the type of character and mannerisms he has. Right? And God tells us in the Quran, and he tells us that this Prophet is a role model for us to emulate him and his actions. Okay? All right. And so then what happens? So she has a cousin, or an uncle, if I remember correctly. His name was Waraq ibn Nawfal. All right. And he was a Christian monk. So he was well versed in various traditions and the history of religion. All right. So they go to him, and Prophet Muhammad is now talking to this man. All right. To this man named Waraqa, and he's a Christian monk. And he hears this story. And as soon as he concludes, he sits there and thinks for a little bit, and he tells the Prophet something that he'll never forget. He says, I swear by God, you are the Prophet of this community. Because the Jews and the Christians at that time were waiting for a prophet to come from certain areas in this peninsula. So Waraq ibn Nawfal says, I swear by God, you are the Prophet that is being foretold about. The angel of revelation that came to Moses has come to you. So he immediately recognizes that this is revelation coming from angel Gabriel, or Jibreel in Arabic. He says, if only I were younger and could live to see your people kick you out. Now here the Prophet's like, why would they kick me out? I'm someone they trusted, right? I'm an honorable person. I don't do all these things that they fall into, these evil actions, right? I'm just, and you can list all the things that, for instance, that his wife listed, right? He does all these things. Why on earth would my people kick me out? And he says to them, and he says, Waraqah replies to the Prophet, he says, indeed, every single person that came with this message was attacked by his people. And if I live to see that day, then I'll support you. Now what ended up happening was he actually ended up passing away not too long after this incident. But this also shows you the type of support system he had, as well as that if someone who was a Christian monk was able to recognize these signs in him. All right? So this is the beginning of revelation. Okay? Now, for the first couple years, Islam wasn't something that was super public. All right? Because you can imagine, there's only like maybe a handful of people that the Prophet would talk to in privacy and privately to talk to them about this faith, right? To come with this message. Okay? And he did so, and it was a pretty wise thing. So for the first 3 years, it was spread privately, right? So the Prophet would talk to people that he trusted and that he could rely on, all right? So he's essentially building like a support system and a support cast. Now, something that's not in the slides, and please take note of this in your notes. Sometimes there's a difference of opinion between scholars as to who like the first Muslim was, right, after the Prophet. But there's a great scholar, and his name was Imam Nawawi. He mentions, and he says, because they usually say that there is four types of people, there are four people that could have been the first Muslim. And so Imam Nawawi, what he does is instead of saying this person was the first Muslim or that person was the first Muslim, he kind of combines them all together in one sentence, all right? So he says the first woman that entered Islam was the wife of the Prophet. Her name was Khadija, okay? The first adult male that converted to Islam was the Prophet's close friend, Abu Bakr, all right? Abu Bakr, A-B-U space B-A-K-R, all right? And he was the closest friend of the Prophet, all right? The first young man that converted to Islam was Ali, right? The first free man, right? And the first servant that entered Islam was Zayd, okay? All right? So that's not something here, but that's something you can take on the side for your notes, all right? Yeah, he was a servant of the Prophet, peace be upon him. He lived in the same house. Essentially, yeah. So, yeah. Okay? Now, what happens after these first 3 years? So now the Prophet, peace be upon him, is spreading the message privately, right? To people that he knows he can support him, and to people he knows will not have too much of an issue with the truth, okay? So now, after about a period of 3 years, revelation is now calling to Allah. God asks and commands now the Prophet to go openly and spread it publicly, all right? So now the time has come, and so what does the Prophet do? Okay, the verses in Revelation that we talk about, you can see in chapter 59, verses 94 and 95. Okay, now declare openly what you are commanded, and turn away from the polytheists. We will suffice for you against those who mock you. Okay, now remember the Prophet, when he's doing this, he's about to bear himself because he knows people, as Waraq bin Nawfal mentioned, he knows people will not take the message lightly. All right. Because what he's calling to them is he's calling them to leaving their luxury, their violent passion for wealth. All right. So whenever you see someone like this and you tell them not to do it, you have to do so very wisely. All right. And he knows he's bracing essentially for impact. Okay. So how exactly does this occur? Now at that time there was a large hill that when someone needed to make an emergency announcement, he would go to the top of that hill and he would yell out to the people, kind of like a siren or a warning call, all right? So he goes to the hill and he starts yelling out, "Oh, my people," right? Now, when someone's on that hill, it's a very serious issue. It means, life or death at that point in time. So everybody drops everything and goes to him, okay? And he yells to them and he says, "If I were to tell you that there are people behind this hill ready to attack you, would you believe me?" They all said yes. They would all willingly trust him with their lives. All right. They wouldn't be like, "Well, you're not really a trustful person. Let's climb up the hill and see." And no, they for sure, without a doubt, yes. So now he starts calling out the tribes, one by one by one. And he calls them out and he says, "I have been commanded by God to warn you, and I cannot protect you in this world, nor can I promise you anything of the next life unless you acknowledge and submit to the worship of God alone." Now, why is it alone in here? We talked about this last class, right? What violates the testimony of faith and believing in God isn't that you don't believe that God exists, but sometimes these people, they believe God existed, but they would worship other than him alongside with God. All right? And so he's telling them this, and can you imagine what the response is? The response is, oh, there's two of the same slide, I'm sorry. "And should you ask them," right, and this is talking about the point before, "who created the heavens and the earth? They would most certainly say, Allah, God. But why is it then that they do not believe and worship him alone?" All right. What was their response? Their response was, "Stop wasting our time. Like, who are you fooling?" Right? These same people who literally a minute before said, "We trust you with our lives," now are telling him, "Buzz off, leave us alone." All right. We don't want anything to do with what you're calling to. Because they know the ramifications. They know that if they do so, they have to change their lifestyle, right? And when people get to that certain lifestyle, power can be very, very attractive, and they don't want to let it go. All right? So, now let's talk about what exactly and how exactly what was God's plan to changing these people. So, now revelation is coming, and it's coming constantly. And the Prophet is now also praying openly and praying in front of people. And when people at that time, pilgrimage isn't something that Muslims only did before. Even before Islam came, people used to go and do pilgrimage there. Sometimes they would bring their idols. Mecca was well known as a place to go and do pilgrimage and worship God, which is why they had so many idols around it. Okay, so even before Islam, it was seen as something, as a holy sanctimony, a holy site. Okay, so they would go there and they would do these things. And so whenever this would happen during the pilgrimage season, Prophet Muhammad would go there. He would pray out loud. He would tell people about Islam, and he would try and spread the message. Okay, now they didn't always accept it. But, sometimes they're like, sure, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes they believe in him. Sometimes they'd be very, have a lot of animosity towards him, okay? And in some narrations, they would, slaughter animals and pour their guts on him while he was praying, okay? Some people were literally abused and slaved and killed because of this belief, right? And some of these people were slaves. It's not like they're able to go around and change the political atmosphere. But even the people that were enslaved at that time, if they believed in this, they would be abused and tortured to leave it and abandon it. Even though they had no way of actually changing the society around them. Even if they just personally had that belief in them, they would still be punished. Okay? So, then let's ask ourselves a question. All right? We know that revelation is coming down. We know that this society is in need of a drastic change. What was God's curriculum for these people? What's really beautiful is if you study the Quran, we can never fully 100% understand everything. That's how eloquent it is, right? But when we look to it, we can try and learn and benefit from different wisdoms, not just from the verses themselves, but the themes that came down. So when the scholars talk about early revelation, they say that there's 4 types of themes during that early period of revelation. All right. Now we ask ourselves, what is the wisdom behind these themes? And we'll go one by one and we'll discuss what is the wisdom behind this, right? So first and foremost, to a society that worshiped more than just God, what is the theme? What do you think God is going to talk to them about? Monotheism. Makes sense, right? There's one God and he's trying to give them a message. If they can believe in just him, then everything else will be fine, right? They'll worship and believe in all the rest of it as well. Which is normally why most people, when they talk to others about Islam, unfortunately, they get caught up on the law and the legal aspects of Islam. But to be honest and frank, how many of us are Muslims because we're told to pray 5 times a day? How many of us are Muslim because, men dress like this, women dress like this? Or how many of us are Muslim because we give just 2.5% in charity, right? People don't accept faith because of legal items and actions. People accept faith because of who God is, right? So it only makes sense that early revelation talked and discussed about who exactly God was, right? And the biggest and most important aspect of God is to worship him alone, in the monotheistic aspect of God, all right? And God revelation would question the power of their idols, right? So you pray to this God. Is he able to actually hold you accountable for what you did? Does he hear what you ask him? Does he respond to your cries for help? Is he capable of helping you in a time of need? Is he the one that gives you sustenance in daily life? No. So then why would you worship them? So some of the forms of discussing monotheism is talking about God, but also putting to question their beliefs in their idols. Because if someone was to pray to a rock or something, and you asked him these questions, it would make him question himself, why am I praying to this rock? One of the famous companions, his name is Umar, and we'll talk about Umar probably next week, right? One day he was seen laughing, okay? And so someone was like, what's so funny? Share with us, right? You ever hang out with your friends, they start laughing, you're like, why are you laughing? What's so funny? So he tells him, I remembered an incident before I became Muslim, okay? He had made an idol out of dates and he was traveling. And while he was traveling, he ran out of food. So what did he do? He ate the idol, right? So he ate it. And then later on, people are like, and so he remembers this later on, and he's laughing at this scenario, right? This thing that he prayed to, that he put reliance in, like it gave him sustenance in the fact that he ate it, right? Like that was about it, all right? And so he started laughing at this. And so when God sends these verses down of Revelation to these people and is discussing monotheism, realize that he's doing so to get them to rely on him alone, so that then later on legal actions can be worshipped and can be followed, right? Because if you believe in God the most wise, God the most just, God the most merciful, God the most that knows everything, if you believe in all these things about God, then you wouldn't question in a negative manner what the laws are. You would try and understand and derive wisdoms from it, because it's coming from someone who's a lot wiser and much more knowledgeable than us. Right? Does that make sense? So then we ask ourselves, okay? And the reason for this is for us to reflect on our own lives as well. Because when, faith isn't like you have it or you don't, right? It's like a wave. Some days your faith is like amazing, right? So maybe you're praying like extra prayers, you're giving extra money to poor people, you're going above and beyond, right? And sometimes it's a little down, and that's understandable, right? We're not angels, we're not perfect. We have our good days, we have our bad days. So when we do have our bad days, realize that at least fulfill the bare minimum that's required from us, and reflect on these themes for early revelation, because this is the curriculum that God gave people to change themselves, all right? So when you're feeling down, maybe open up the Quran and go and look at the verses that were revealed in Mecca, and then read them and analyze them and apply them to your life. Because this is the curriculum that God gave us, right? That God gave these people. Okay? So that's the first theme, is monotheism, right? The second was a call to morals and ethics. Okay? The oppression done to orphans and widows, burying their daughters alive. This stuff needed to end right now. Okay? It needed to end right now. And in fact, it needed to end yesterday. But now is fine as well, as long as it's stopping. Okay? And this makes sense, right? This makes sense. In Islamic legal theory, they have a discussion, right? If you have a person who engages in sin, but doesn't always, and does not do a lot of worship, okay? What should you call him to do first? Should you call him to worship in God and then later on removing the sin? Or should you call him to removing the bad and then later on he can do better, right? So let me ask you a question. Physically, right? Would you call someone to go do exercise, or would you call someone to try and remove and afflict from some sort of issue? Let's say someone needs surgery, right? Are you going to go to him, someone that needs surgery because they have a bad limb or something? You're going to tell him that, you need to go exercise? You're going to tell him to remove the bad things first, right? You're going to remove the bad things first. It just makes sense, right? So same here. Before we can teach people to pray 5 times a day and do this and this and this and this, we've got to make sure that we remove the bad ethical issues as well, right? Because in essence, the Prophet tells us that he came to perfect noble character, to teach people to perfect their character, right? And some of the methods of doing so is this, right? Removing oppression, all right? Any questions on these two so far? Okay. And same too, and it's a great way for us to look at our lives as well. Again, when we're having these lulls, make sure that we're at least having ethical, we have ethical limits and standards we abide by with other people. Because sometimes we might have a bad day, but that doesn't mean we get to go and be abusive or verbally abusive to somebody else, right? Any questions so far? Okay. The third theme of Revelation is previous generations. All right. Now, what is some of the wisdoms behind this? I'm going to open this up for everyone here. What is so important about Prophet Jesus, Moses, Noah, Abraham, all of them along with their people, right? What is some of the wisdoms we can extract from this? Sister Vanessa? Okay. Hmm. Good. So they needed to be mentioned because they had a contribution, as well as what was the second part? Good. Hmm. So there were people that accepted the message of Jesus and Moses, and then there were people that didn't accept it. So these stories show the good and the bad, right? This is the message, just like these previous messages that came before it. And if you accept it, good things will happen. If you don't, you could be under threat of punishment, just like they were, right? So it could also be seen as a warning, right? Very good. Anybody else? Mm. Good. So all these prophets also came with the same message of monotheism, right? So if anyone was maybe a Christian or a Jew or anything else, this is the same message that came to Moses and to Jesus, and to prove the legacy of prophethood in the Prophet Muhammad. Very good. Muhammad?
I was going to say for clarification that basically it's basically the same thing that they all
Okay. Right. To show the same, how this message is aligned with all the previous messages. Okay. What else? Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. So it shows them again, right? Like as we mentioned, if they don't do it, this is also not just like teaching them, but it's not just there for a history lesson. It's kind of a warning, right? Okay. Now these are great things for everyone else to reflect on. But what about the Muslims? What about the Prophet? What would he reflect on these?
I think, I don't know if this is correct, but I think there were people who never actually had a prophet among them.
What do you mean, the Arabs?
Yeah.
Okay. But what about for, okay, so it's also like, all right, now you have a message. And that's actually very important because now this message is not just coming to a certain tribe or anything like previous revelation was, right? In the first stages of Islam, obviously it was confined to certain parts of Arabia where the Prophet lived, but it was a universal message for everyone. Now this is the seal of prophets, and this message is now for everyone that ever walks on the face of the earth. Not just people that were children of Israel, not just people in this land or that land, but for everybody, okay? Including the Arabs at that time. Very good.
The Prophet ﷺ needed encouragement and needed to learn out of the old school.
Good. So now this is also training, not necessarily training, but showing Prophet Muhammad what the other prophets had to go through as well, right? And to teach him to be patient. Because these other prophets had people that mocked them just as much as you are, right? And in fact, we go back to this, the story of the monk, Waraqa bin Nawfal, right? Not a single prophet before you that came with this message was left except for his people attacked him. So this is telling the prophet, these stories, they need to take warning and learn that this is bad for what they do if they don't accept it. But you know what, Muhammad? You're going to face these kinds of people. And these are your family members. This is your uncle that will be doing that. These are your friends and close family members that you grew up with that might turn on you, right? Just like close members and, you know, friends and family and everyone else did so to Prophet Jesus and Moses and Noah, okay? Very good. Did you have a question? Just stretching? Next time you stretch it, you have to say something. All right? So it's very critical. And in fact, what I would like for us to do is kind of like a homework, all right? Let me see what chapter. All right, so this is the homework and it'll be sent out in the email. Remember, if you're not on the email list, please see me so we can get you on this email list. It goes out every Wednesday in the afternoon, all right? Your homework is this. Pick a chapter. So if you go to a Quran, if you go to the table of contents, the index, right? It'll say Mecca or Medina, okay? Meccan or Madani. And this is where the majority of the verses of this chapter were revealed. Now, some chapters have verses that were revealed in both parts, okay? What I want you guys to do is in the, after chapter 71 to the end, pick a chapter from there that was revealed in Mecca, all right? Or maybe 2 or 3, because some of them are short. Pick a couple, and go through and write down on a separate piece of paper what some of the themes you realize and recognize from this. All right? And then maybe some of the wisdoms that you can derive behind it. Okay? Mecca. Okay? Because we're talking about these themes now. All right? So again, go through chapters between 71 and 114. Pick one or two, like a good amount of verses, and read through these verses. And every time you come across a verse that has one of these themes, like put a tick mark, right? Like theme 1, theme 2, theme 3, or whatever. And then like kind of summarize what the lessons behind the chapters were. All right? So that this is something now, another way for you to reflect on the verses. Okay? So it's not just reflecting on the verses themselves, but the methodology behind the verses as well. Okay? Because if you can learn the methodology behind it, then learning and understanding and putting the verse into context becomes easier. Okay? And this is one way for us to actually make the Quran a message that's very personal within us as well. All right? So while Revelation ended, it being a message for us never did. Okay? Any questions on the homework? All right. We'll wrap up and then we'll have about 10, 15 minutes for question and answer. The fourth is a belief system. Okay? So God constantly mentions angels. Okay? Revelation, like we talked about in previous generations. The day of judgment. All right? So issues that have to deal with belief systems. Okay? Now, what do you think the purpose of these are? So some of the verses dealing with revelation, with angels for instance, Allah tells us, kiraman katibin, right? So those noble, right? We have angels that record everything we do. Okay? We have angels that are there for revelation, like angel Gabriel. Gabriel. I'm sorry, I'm speaking Arabic, right? Arabic and English combined. All right? There's an angel of death, right? We have angels guarding the gates of heaven, the gates of hell. Okay? Angels constantly in the worship of God. So what is the purpose of angels? What do you think the reasoning for teaching these people that are in this circumstance, in this society, what is the purpose of teaching them about angels? Mm-hmm. Good, right? There's these other creations, right? And angel Gabriel isn't just like a small, right? He's humongous, right? These angels are huge, right? So humble yourself a little bit, okay? Very good, all right? Good. You don't necessarily have to see something to believe in it, right? Because these angels are real, and if you can, right, and the knowledge of the unseen is called, right, ilm al-ghayb in Arabic, right? You don't necessarily have the ability to learn everything just by seeing it. Okay, very good. What else?
God does not need us to worship these creatures because He has the capability to create infinite number of creatures that can worship Him indefinitely.
God does not need us for worship. That's very beautiful. Because there are angels that have been, ever since their creation, that have been just prostrating to God. Ever since they were created. Right? So, God is not in need of our worship. We're in need of God. So that's another reflection. Very good. All right, what else? Check yourself before you wreck yourself. I like it. You have angels writing down everything you do, right? And these angels are pure. And there's a very beautiful clip. We'll send it out in the email as well, right? I forgot what the title of the clip is, but essentially the speaker is saying, don't make these honorable creatures write down filthy actions you do. So it's a way of you recognizing and realizing, oh wait, there are angels. Obviously, God sees me all the time. But these angels also are here, and we want to honor them by not making them write down these filthy actions you might do, or the words that you might say. Okay? So it's also a way of self-accountability. extra accountability, right? Yes. What's your name, young man? Faisal. How old are you, Faisal? 7. MashaAllah. Good. That these angels are capable of actually physically protecting you, right? So sometimes when the Prophet was being attacked by other people, there were angels that intervened, right? So it's a very good point, Faisal. Jazakallah khair. MashaAllah. All right. Anybody else? What's the difference between humans and angels? Go ahead.
Actually, angels, that was I was about to say that angels are ordered to worship,
Mm-hmm.
while humans, we have a choice
Mm.
to follow or not follow to the teachings of God's teachings. So it's our choice, and we will be rewarded according to our choice.
Good. Free will, right? Angels don't have free will. They've been ordered, and their function is worship. Humans, on the other hand, have free will, which means we can choose to worship God or not. And in essence, if we do choose to, it actually makes us a little more superior than angels. But what's also beautiful about it is that when we commit an error, seeking repentance. Otherwise, God would have made us angels. But He wants us to seek that repentance and to seek His forgiveness, right? So there's also an element of hope and mercy when He teaches us about angels, because we are not them, and He knows we'll make mistakes, and He created us like this, because as the Prophet tells us, the best of those who sin are those who seek forgiveness, right? So teaching us about these angels and this belief system creates a sense of hope in God's mercy for us as well, right? It's very powerful stuff, very powerful, okay? Revelation we touched on a little bit with the previous generations, okay? And teaching these people in this type of society that there is a concept of revelation, because God does know what you do, and He does see what you're doing, and He's warning you to stop, right? But revelation wasn't always just warning, okay? In the Quran it says that Muhammad was sent as shahid, right, a witness, wa mubashiran wa nadhira, and someone who gave glad tidings and also warned people, okay? So there is a concept of there was warning for people, but there was glad tidings as well. All right? So we should never forget that. Okay? And the angel of the day of judgment, what reflections and wisdoms do we have behind this? Mm-hmm. Mm. Good. So this society had different types of people, right? So teaching them about the day of judgment for someone that was like, let's say for instance, a leader of people that oppressed others was kind of like a warning for him. For those who believed in God, it was a sign of hope and mercy, right? For those that were able to actually do deeds to change their lives, it was a sign of, you know what, do so because you will be rewarded. And for those that couldn't physically able to do it, a sign of justice, because God would never let anything in this world go without having a decree for it, right? So we talked about someone who's facing oppression, all right? So the first people in Islam was named by Ammar and his family, right? His wife Sumayya, his mother Sumayya, his father was Yasir, Ammar bin Yasir, right? Ammar's mother and father were both persecuted to death. And the Prophet would see this going on. This is very early in Islam. They weren't physically able to actually do anything about it. And so the Prophet, peace be upon him, would say, Sabrun ya ahl Yasir, right? Ahl Yasir. Patience, O family of Yasir, فَإِنَّ مَوْعِدُكُمُ الْجَنَّةِ. For verily your appointment is heaven. Okay? So it's also a sign of you might face oppression in this life. You might face difficulty, but guess what? Nothing goes without its reward. All right. So it's also a sign of hope in that sense as well. Um, we have about 10 minutes left. We'll open it up for question and answer. Hopefully, firstly, specifically with the topics covered today, and then we can open it up as well, inshallah. So, Jazakallah khair. Bismillah, if you guys have any questions. Any questions on this stuff right now? Mm-hmm. Children of Israel. So it was like a location, but they had prophets come to them, like Musa and Isa. Hmm? I don't know that it necessarily does, yeah. Because remember, after the coming of the prophet, he's the seal of the prophets. Now, anyone who hears this message, even if they used to follow Jesus and Moses before, are obligated now to following Muhammad. And I'm sorry I didn't bring that up earlier. Right? So even at the time of the prophet, there were some people that were still on the tradition or path of Abraham. Okay? But after the coming of Muhammad, because he is the seal of the prophets and he was sent to mankind, not just to one area, they are now obligated to following him. Okay? So that's a good question. So thank you. Sorry I didn't mention that earlier. So, yes. Pretty similar. It also depends on like the specific story you're talking about. So, because like for instance, the children of Israel during the time of Moses was different than, right? So the group of people, it just depends on what specific story is being referenced. Yeah. For Surah Baqarah, usually those stories are about Musa. Yeah, if I remember. Also, it depends on which one because there could be others in the surah as well. So usually they're grouped together. But if I think the one that you're thinking of is Musa. Yeah. Good question. All right, now we can open up to some other questions, earlier slides, yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So there's some verses that say about, I'm repeating it, about some Christians and Jews, right? The Sabians, right? If they believe in God and do the works, that they will be entered into heaven. Okay. Now these verses are not saying that they don't have to believe in Muhammad, and they're not talking about necessarily people at this day that know about Muhammad. Okay. But before, right, as we talked about, people of Jesus and Moses, they were Jews and Christians. So if they followed the message that was given to them, then they will be entered into Jannah, into heaven. Okay. Now, does this apply to today? Only if, some scholars say, if the person has no knowledge at all about Islam, right? So say, for instance, someone like lives in like the North Pole or something, right? And there's no mosque in the North Pole. I've never been there to teach them a class about Islam. No one's gone out there, right? So let's say like there's like a tribe up there and they follow like the path of Jesus or Moses, right? They follow earlier revelation, then maybe it could apply to them. But anyone who hears about Muhammad is now obligated to follow this path. Follow up. Good. Okay, so I'm sorry, I should have clarified. What if they hear lies? Whoever hears the authentic Islam, right? So if, for instance, someone that's educated only by Fox News or whatever, then, right, they might need, they definitely shouldn't, right? Like, it, so that, I hope that, does that answer your question? Yeah, so if someone hears about an inauthentic or not a true version of Islam, then it's not going to be held accountable. They're not going to. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But because even at that time, right, we believe at that time that there was no concept of Trinity when he was alive. But I mean, some scholars might go into more detail as to what like denominations of Christians count, because then you really have to get into learning about Christianity. So I don't want to say like which ones necessarily it refers to. But yeah, good question. Mm-hmm. You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, Jazakallah khair. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make this. Yes. Hmm. So the question is, if like you're praying, let's say like wherever, and someone is smoking around you, do you have to stop prayer? No. No, you should complete the prayer, and then yeah, that's it. Because smoking doesn't necessarily like break a prayer, nor does someone smoking around you break a prayer. But if it's something like distraction and stuff, afterwards just tell them, when I'm praying, please don't smoke around me. Yeah. Good question. Okay. Yes.
This is actually a third question. My brother and I are curious about. We sort of recite in a way where we're trying to, because it's hard for us to really get the Arabic down.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're reciting it, like if we're trying to beautify it, and it's hard for us to really grasp each word.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we do is sometimes in our minds when we're doing like a bit of a prayer where it's sounding sort of in your head, we kind of say each word like Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, trying to get each word. Is that wrong or is that?
So the question is, like, when you're reciting in prayer, because you want to understand it, you want to recite like word by word, as opposed to like tying the verse together, because you want to grasp the meaning.
In a way, just a little more slowly.
Yeah, slowly, more methodical, 100% acceptable, and probably even encouraged to do so, because the meaning behind it is what's really like the meat of the issue. So, good question. So somebody else's hand. Okay, Brother Rash. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the purpose of doing the pointing your finger when you're doing the testimony of faith, usually it's first we do it because that's one of the ways that the Prophet would pray. Also, generally, when people usually recite the testimony of faith, you see them go like this, because it's talking about worshiping one God. So it's the same thing in the prayer when you're sitting. That's the portion you do it for, is when you're saying that there is nothing worthy of worship except for God, and Muhammad is his messenger, right? Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. And you'll see this actually, people like take this and also do it outside of prayer as well. So whenever someone does the testimony, they'll do it like that, right? Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. So, because it's talking about worshiping just one God above. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, moving other fingers. So there's there's a lot of scholarly discussion on how the finger should move, because there's different narrations of how the Prophet would do it. So if you ask like your specific teacher that teaches you, then they'll be able to show you like some of the narrations and stuff. But I mean, at the end of the day, like all that's required is just doing it like that, and then anything extra after you want to do that, if you want to learn about it, you can implement it later on. It's fine. So yes, good question. But if you don't do it, it's fine, as long as you do the So we're good. So you don't have to do that and stuff. So yeah. The first one you should do for Allahu Akbar. The first time you should raise your hands. But the initial one, I don't know about that. I know that that's actually the one where you should do it. Yeah. But yeah, alhamdulillah. Okay. All right. Jazakallah khair, everyone, for coming. Hope to see you guys next Sunday as well. And you should be hearing from me on Wednesday. Jazakallah khair. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Oh Allah, make this gathering a gathering of peace. Make the knowledge that we gain knowledge that is beneficial, and protect us from the punishments of the hellfire. Assalamu alaikum.